You promised me once that you're telling me more about the punk rock scene economics. Are you ready for that?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, this is the beauty of, again, I do this to other people, so this is karmic retribution. So here's the cool thing about, I call this punk rock economics. I think it's super important for anybody building any small business in particular. There's a whole scale point that I'm just starting to understand in the last couple of months. That's also super interesting to me. But punk rock economics is when you're 15 years old, 14 years old, you decide to start a band because you have the audacity to think that you have something to say to the world and the world wants to listen. There's a difference here that's really important, and this is kind of like part of the punk rock aspect of it. Part of punk rock, part of the rock and roll revolution, part of like the Beatles coming and everybody wants to play guitar, being a guitar band. Pre-punk rock being a thing is this concept of you don't have to go to Juilliard or something. You don't have to get blessed or sanctioned by anybody to do anything. You can just start doing it. No one can tell you no. You can just start. And then you find out like your friend's brother's band or whatever is doing, and you're like, well, if he can do that, I'm at least as good a guitar player or a better guitar player than him. And then the challenge just becomes, okay, well, can I find another like guitar player or a drummer? And then you figure that out at school and whatever else. And then next thing you know, you can put a band together. And that's kind of what ends up happening is you put a band together. Now, once you put a band together, luckily there's this network of people playing these shows. So the way it would go is, let's say if I have a four-person band and you have a four-person band, there's 15 people at the show. You got 10 people to play in front of. You multiply that out, and if somebody has 5 friends, let alone one friend, all of a sudden you have 20 or 30 people in a room. And again, you didn't have to go to Juilliard to get there. Like, it's okay if you stink or you suck. It doesn't mean that band's going to exist. Lots of bands would get up, play a show, and then disappear, never to be seen again.
Right.
But all of a sudden, the realization was, if you get good, the other friends and the other fans will then like you. That's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2 is that like the more of them you get to like you, like the better the invites you get from other people. But at its core level, it's a social networking thing. So unless you can put the band together, unless you can make friends with the other friends of the other bands and get into the same things, you can't be in the mix to make all this stuff happen. That's the real magic of punk rock economics. Basically says you are not just building something that's financially viable, you're actually building something that is socially viable. That's what punk rock economics is.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on this show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is Matt Zeigler. He's been on Talking Billions before, and he was also the guest host when we turned the tables. Matt asked me questions on Talking Billions, very first Fireside chat with the host. He's back, and we have lots to discuss. Matt is a managing director and private wealth advisor at Sunpointe Investments. He helps clients create, align, and manage their financial plans and investment strategies. Matt's talent turned skill is engaging people on their level. In his words, finance may be complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated. Outside of work, Matt has a long-standing interest in all things creativity and culture related. He was born and raised in Pennsylvania, received his undergraduate degree in music from the University of Hartford. You can find him with his eyes on the book, his ears in some music, his nose over the stove, his feet on a trail, and his mind on the markets and the markets on his mind. I've been greatly enjoying his cultish creative blog posts, which I highly recommend. Matt has his podcast, The Intentional Investor, and Just Hit Record. He also does incredibly insightful reviews of books. I'm including the links in the notes, cultishcreative.com. Matt has been generous enough to introduce me to quite a few of his podcast guests that I had the pleasure of hosting on Talking Billions. I also did my best to send him a number of fascinating earlier Talking Billions guests. Matt is one of those souls who leave every place and everyone better after his visit or appearance. And I've been enjoying his positive, karmic path in my pursuit of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Today we discuss a variety of topics. We start with the power of stories and bridges between generations. Matt reminds me of the importance of listening and giving time and attention to others, including clients. We take on the topic of nostalgia and a whole variety of experiences around it. We learn about business, money, economics from the punk rock music scene. Matt shares what it means to be independently happy. Stay tuned until the end. We're right about the moment we're about to turn off the microphone. Matt tells me a very emotional story of one particular painting that has great importance to him. A story that beautifully frames the entire conversation we've had today. All right, please help me welcome Matt Zeigler. Hi, Matt. How are you? So nice to see you.
Bogomil, my dear friend. Good to see you.
Well, so I'm pulling a Matt today, and I'm going to explain what it means. So I usually share the questions with my guests, so they're comfortable and prepared, even if they go with the flow. And you invited me, and you didn't share questions with me, so I thought, you know what, I'm going to do the same to him.
This is some karmic retribution BS, if I ever heard it. I'm ecstatic. The procrastinator in me loves I didn't even have to procrastinate for this. I just opened up the thing on the calendar invite. Here we are. It's wonderful.
I realized from that experience we had is that cool things happen when I don't know the questions, because I think different things come up if you surprise me a little bit. And it's a nice surprise, like you have a way of finding things that I haven't thought about for a while, and I have to really think about it, especially if it's something from a few decades ago, and it's almost like retelling a story of somebody else. So I want to play that game today with you, and I borrowed a question from actually a good friend, Matthew Stafford, who was on the show, and he asked me, what's your earliest happy memory? And I've been thinking that I don't know what was Matt's earliest happy memory. So do you remember what's your earliest happy memory, just to kick it off?
So that's great. And I have Matthew. I can't reach it. I can see it across the room from me. My copy of Find Your Nine Others is over there somewhere. Yeah,
he's great.
I'm bugging him. I got to get him on one of the Just Press Record podcasts. Earliest. So earliest is hard, but I'm going to say the first thing that popped in my head, and it's a picture I have that I don't know if I remember exactly the picture being taken, but I remember the feeling of it. And so there's a cool thing in my family. I can't remember if I've told you this story before about the compressed generations in my family. So both of my parents So my grandparents are only like 20 years older than my parents, and then my parents were in their early 20s when they had me. So like I was at my grandfather's 50th birthday party. Like this is the crazy compression of generations, and then the experience of getting like I grew up with all four grandparents around. We only just lost my grandmother a couple of years ago now. I'm having dinner with my 93-year-old grandfather on Friday this week. So
Wow.
it's a really cool thing. So there's this picture of my mom's dad and I, and we spent a lot of time at their house in outside of Allentown, Pennsylvania. And there's this picture of us, and he's been doing yard work. He's mid 40s basically at this point. He's a little bit older than I am now, and he's been doing yard work all day. We're both leaning up against the front of the Cadillac or whatever the car was in the back. I think it's one of the Cadillacs. And he's got his shirt off, little Italian guy, basically somewhere between like Joe Pesci and Danny DeVito is that grandfather in all the ways, all the good ways. And like he's got like a beer in one hand with his shirt off, and somebody hands me like a root beer or something or an empty beer bottle or whatever in my hand, and we're both standing in the exact same pose, leaning up against the bumper of the car, holding our drinks, and somebody took the picture. And that feeling of being around family, of kind of like copying or emulating like people that it's like, this is cool, this is just a vibe and a scene and an interesting thing. It's one of those like, it's more of a sensory memory than anything else, but it's like I can feel that backyard. I can feel the sun in that backyard. I can feel the feeling of being around family in that setting.
Do you find yourself going back to that memory sometimes?
I found myself in the last several years going back to a lot of those feelings that are in some of those old photographs. And there's a photograph that I use. It's a profile picture in a number of places for me. I think it's my YouTube like profile picture. I know I'm on Instagram now, cultish.creative. It's my picture for that too. I've got this other memory of me in an apartment that we lived in when I was a kid, and I have a red plastic guitar, and I'm
Uh-huh.
standing in front of this chest, and that chest, it still exists. I actually have it in my living room. It was like a gift. I don't know how it survived 40 odd years, but like I've had it. It was a gift when I was born, and it's held clothes or something in it. My entire life, I've had this thing and been able to keep it with me. And so it's me with this red plastic guitar, and I've basically dressed myself up. I'm standing next to the bed in my bedroom. My brother's actually in, his head's in part of the picture, but he usually gets edited out when I have to resize it. And I'm maybe 4 years old. I've got this red plastic guitar because I was obsessed with wanting to play guitar. Actually, like my mom's side of the family, who was all musicians. And it's me with sunglasses on and a hat and my red plastic guitar, and I'm just making this face. And I've spent a lot of time in the last probably like 4 or 5 years, especially trying to reconnect to those feelings of just being like purely happy. There's that pure kid happiness. And I do actually think about that a lot. And that picture showing up in all those places is super, super deliberate.
Where do you find that kind of happiness these days?
Conversations like this is a big one. Uh, that's not me like blowing smoke at you or something. Like genuinely in conversations like this, I find that in connecting with other people, and I find it with in those pictures. And I think if you want to draw a line between the two of them, in the connections, like my grandfather and I leaning up against the car with our drinks, on a summer's day, and then also in the just like the sheer curiosity, the sheer like it's a toy guitar. I don't know how to play guitar yet, and I am just in awe of me in the early 80s at this point, like watching MTV and watching my aunts and uncles run around with their guitars and like sing songs in the basement, and like wanting to be a part of that party and just being like, this thing is a gateway into these other things that make me excited. And so now today it's like, what are those gateways that get me excited? And that's doing creative stuff, that's writing, that's reading or watching or listening or researching to whatever gets me fired up. And I mean, like severe ADHD, I get fired up about everything. It's wonderful.
a lot of passion and fascination. And I want to ask you about the two words down the road. You wrote about them not long ago. But you talk a lot about music, and you're in the money industry. So I'm looking for the bridge. Tell me more about that music. 4 years old, it was already in your life. And whenever we talk, you have a song for a reference somewhere. Everything is a song to you. Tell me how that music became a part of your life, and then how that leap happened, that you saw the music in the money world, and a very specific aspect of the money world that we'll talk more about in a second. But how did that happen?
So, I'm going to give you the two layers of this, because one of them I just wrote about the other day, and I'll kind of share the story publicly because I hadn't really talked about this ever publicly before. So you get your exclusive here. The first thing though is so my parents are the oldest siblings in each of their respective families. So their parents were young when they had them. They were young when they had me. That means I have, aunts and uncles who are close in age. Like they have younger siblings that are almost more like cousins to me. And that also means like they were still my dad was still in grad school. Like they were in party mode when stuff was happening. So we're hanging out in my grandparents' basement, and everybody in my mom's family like sings, plays guitar, or in many cases both, plays an instrument or both. And so the family would get together. They're doing what 20-year-olds do on a holiday or whatever else. They're having drinks, they're having a good time. Only my parents had kids at that point, and all the guitars and the instruments come out and everybody's playing, and it's a scene. It's one of those things where everybody is happy when the guitars come out, when all these things happen. That imprints on me. And then growing up in the house, especially, so by the time I've got a brother who's basically 2 years younger than me, and then another brother several years after that, but growing up in a series of small apartments and other things, and my dad at work all the time, my mom figuring out when she went back to work too, and a lot of just the radio. We had the tapes and the records that we would play, but we also had the radio, and then MTV would be on kind of constantly, not as a babysitter, not anything like that. It's just always on in the background, and it would go back and forth between whatever the pop hits of the era are, and then the old stuff when they would put it on. And what would be really cool is we'd be with all the siblings, and they'd be playing the Neil Youngs and the John Prynes and all this stuff, and I'm slowly getting indoctrinated into the wordplay of like the John Prynes and stuff like that. But then at the same time, it's, you're watching MTV and you're seeing Run DMC and you're seeing the Beastie Boys and you're seeing all this stuff, and you're just like, your eyes are just taking this all in, and you're like, there's this connection between what happens in my grandparents' basement and what happens in the rest of the world. Following the line of that, the fast forward short story, but I'm not going to forget the fun thing because I have it right over here next to me. The fun thing that happens is I grow up just trying to chase that over and over and over again. I end up doing music for work starting in high school, and meaning to get paid. It didn't feel like work. It was like the greatest trick ever is when you work in construction one summer, realize how much you hate it, and then you stumble your way into like getting paid for music, and you're like, oh, this is so much better. And then you find out you're getting paid like you're making in 2 weeks and one night what like your friends are making at McDonald's, and you're like, come on, like this is so, chasing that a lot lately too. But the idea is you get exposed to that stuff when you see the economic benefits of doing these things, and you're trying to earn little kid money. You're not trying to earn life-changing professional money. You're just like, you want to buy some CDs or some tapes and you're happy. The business learning lessons, like that's the connection. You can actually trade something you love that makes other people happy for money, and then take that money and build other cool things out of. And it's the layering of those gateways. All right, so I have to tell you this too. So like I have these three tapes right here. And we got 2 Red Hot Chili Peppers albums, and then we have the Beavis and Butthead Experience. So classy stuff. These were 3 of the tapes that I would do dishes with in our old apartment, and then in one of our first houses, because my job was dishes for a family of 5. And I would listen to these like on my headphones. And I had the moment we accidentally got, do you know like green palm olive dish soap? Have you ever used green palm?
Yes.
It has a very distinct smell.
Yes.
That's always what we had growing up.
Uh-huh.
And so we like, I don't know if we accidentally bought some or somehow we end up with it. And I go to do dishes, this was like a month or two ago. I don't think I've really smelled that since I was probably like 10 years old or whatever. And as soon as like it hit the sponge, I was just like, I am listening to a Red Hot Chili Peppers cassette. Like it's 1991 or two or whatever. And it was just this visceral memory. And I've thought multiple times about this, but they were one of like the gateway bands for me discovering all these other things, like connecting my parents' music collection to what was on MTV and everything else. And I just think in these layers, and music and money and the whole path. It's all these layers and how they stack. And I'm happy when I'm thinking about the stacking of those layers. It's just the way it is.
Connecting the dots. You promised me once that you'll tell me more about the punk rock scene economics. Are you ready for that?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, this is the beauty of, again, I do this to other people, so this is karmic retribution. So here's the cool thing about, I call this punk rock economics. You can call it probably a million other things, and there's probably technical terms for it. But this is a whole part behind me doing these Just Press Record podcasts on my YouTube channel, is I'm a believer that industries make up words to basically block other people out. We make them up for specific reasons. There's specificity required to say, I'm doing this and not that. You need those words. You need some of that jargon. But we box people out by putting fancy words on things.
Right.
Number one, as a person who remembers what it was like to be boxed out in finance and all the things to come in and do, it was this dual experience. We're going to come back to punk rock economics, I promise. This dual experience that I had between being boxed out of finance because I don't know what a stock or a bond is. Like I remember that feeling in 2006 or 7 when I was like, I'm fuzzy on what these things are at best. But at the same time, starting to even work in finance on the banking side and everything else. And the only reason that happens is because a bunch of people keep telling me I should be working in finance, but I couldn't understand why. Because they're like, you should be working in business. You should be working in finance. And I'd be like, I don't know. And they're like, you should. And then I go, okay, well, like, I don't know what a stock or a bond is, or I don't know what a balance sheet is, or I don't know what these things are. How do these things meet? And the reason was I did actually know a lot of that stuff from the music experience, but I didn't know the terms. And when nobody would take the terms and translate them for me, I felt like an outsider. And then my experience the last, however many years now has been the outsider knowledge is actually what's valuable to me in this industry. Don't fight it. Find a happy place. So punk rock economics, I think, is super important for anybody building any small business in particular. There's a whole scale point that I'm just starting to understand in the last couple of months. That's also super interesting to me. But punk rock economics is when you're 15 years old, 14 years old, you decide to start a band because you have the audacity to think that you have something to say to the world and the world wants to listen. There's a difference here that's really important, and this is kind of like part of the punk rock aspect of it. Part of punk rock, part of the rock and roll revolution, part of like the Beatles coming and everybody wants to play guitar, being a guitar band. Pre-punk rock being a thing is this concept of you don't have to go to Juilliard or something. You don't have to get blessed or sanctioned by anybody to do anything. You can just start doing it. No one can tell you no. You can just start. And a cool thing about the area I grew up in, northeastern Pennsylvania, is we're not New York City, we're not Philadelphia, we're not far from either of them. So in this weird place where all the highways cross over, we were a great spot for lots of bands coming through, but we wouldn't always get the big, cool today bands, meaning like the bands of the time. Some of them would come through, stop at, there's a bunch of colleges and stuff in the area. So I got to see some shows for some bigger bands. But a lot of it were like these smaller, these regional bands and stuff on independent labels, hence a really, really amazing punk rock and independent music scene in where I grew up in the 90s. And so you see stuff and you go, I think I could do that. And then you find out like your friend's brother's band or whatever is doing, and you're like, well, if he can do that, I'm I'm at least as good a guitar player or a better guitar player than him. And then the challenge just becomes, okay, well, can I find another like guitar player or a drummer? And then you figure that out at school and whatever else. And then next thing you know, you can put a band together. And that's kind of what ends up happening is you put a band together. Now, once you put a band together, luckily there's this network of people playing these shows. So the way it would go is, let's say if I have a four-person band and you have a four-person band and we know somebody else who has a four-person band, well, all of a sudden the four of us plus at least one friend, we go and we get booked to play at, in our case, the Cafe Metropolis. You go play at the Cafe Metropolis, and if you have three bands and there's four people and a friend in each band, there's 15 people at the show. You got 10 people to play in front of. You multiply that out, and if somebody has 5 friends, let alone one friend, all of a sudden you have 20 or 30 people in a room. And again, you didn't have to go to Juilliard to get there. Like, it's okay if you stink or you suck. It doesn't mean that band's going to exist. Lots of bands would get up, play a show, and then disappear, never to be seen again.
Right.
But all of a sudden, the realization was, if you get good, the other friends and the other fans will then like you. That's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2 is that, like, the more of them you get to like you, like the better the invites you get from other people. But at its core level, it's a social networking thing. So unless you can put the band together, unless you can make friends with the other friends of the other bands and get into the same things, you can't be in the mix to make all this stuff happen. That's the real magic of punk rock economics. Basically says you are not just building something that's financially viable, you're actually building something that is socially viable. That's what punk rock economics is.
You're touching on so many things that will bring us closer to what you do these days. But I love the outsider perspective. And I think because I felt like an outsider on so many occasions, as you know, but I think it allowed you to be much more understanding towards other people. And in the client relationship work that you do these days, and I'm curious to hear more about it, I think it allows you to see that the language, the terminology might be a barrier to explain what is actually happening. I think you and I are both in the world of high net worth individuals, family wealth, multi-generational fortunes, and it takes a lot of explaining, understanding, and empathy. And I think you naturally have that, and that's a gift. And I love the aspect of social networking, and I love the idea of just starting. You know, even this podcast, you and I just started on this journey, right? Like, and we learn as we go, and we have fun with it, and we experiment with the formula and the guests and what we want to do. But tell me more about the work you do today, and let's link it back to that experience that you had through music and punk rock and everything else you discovered on the way.
So it connects back to, people will tell you, and this was a big part of my experience in this business until a few years ago, when I changed the firms that I was associated with and really changed my career trajectory as much as possible and on purpose, is with a job, people are often telling you about, or you're thinking that building the financial value is the main thing. It's the main goal. And something I felt as being part of a much larger organization was I felt this very strong desire with my client relationships that you actually need to invest in the social scene, the social capital, the network that you're building of the clients and the families you serve. That's going to take you way, way, way further than putting any financial priority over and above that. Not to say you have to run a profitable business. You have to understand your P&L. You have to understand all the things that go into it, including reinvesting in the business and marketing and all that stuff. But you have to be able to say, if I want people, punk rock economics, if I want people to come to the show, I need to give them a reason to come to the show. I need to make sure it's accessible. I need to make sure they don't feel boxed out. One thing that I quickly realized with my bands, and then turned it into a whole thing when I was with my college bands and other stuff too, was one of the best things you can do is not be for me, not be like too nichey or too exclusive or, too cool for whatever. Make something that a diverse audience of people will be drawn to if they are. And then it's not intimidating to have, and I look back on this with like great satisfaction. I think of the diversity of people who would show up at even my punk rock band days, like show up at those gigs. And it'd be like, my parents wouldn't think twice about not coming to stand in the back on occasion. A lot at the beginning when I couldn't drive and I needed a ride to these places. Teachers from my school would show up at stuff. Friends from different social cliques and groups would show up. I'll never forget like a group of friends showing up that kind of knew I did it, but kind of didn't. And somebody else dragged them along to something. And afterwards just being like, this is a funny but weird niche memory of just being like, I can't believe you guys played that Stray Cats song from the 80s. I was obsessed with that video when I was a kid. And I was like, me too, because here's two MTV generation kids on two totally different paths, but now we're bonding over it because my band's covering it. And this person's like, oh my God, you just hit this like core memory in my brain. And now we have a whole different, relationship in the sense of we connected over something we didn't even know we had in common because we never said two words to each other in school on a regular day. With clients, this is what I'm doing. It's saying, I am going to set the space. I'm going to create the room and whatever else to make sure you feel seen, heard, valued, and part of this scene, this community, this thing. And then to the degree that you want to get up, tell your story, you want to do your thing or express those ideas, that's the other side of this. I didn't just enjoy being on stage. I enjoyed being in the studio, and that was a whole other thing for me too. So when I think about it from terms of client work too, it's, I can do the song and dance. I can entertain you. I can make this really approachable and accessible, and we can talk about markets and what inflation means to you and translate Fed policy and do the financial planning and the estate planning and make sure, the kids and the grandkids understand not how to screw up the family values as much as the financial values. I can do all that. But we can also sit down and I can go like, okay, now your story. Now it's your turn. And I can take all that curiosity and I can direct it at people. And I think more than anything, that's what people hire me for. A lot of people don't have somebody. This goes for my firm. This is one of our kind of like core values is like, you're the center of attention. When you're talking, we're here to listen to you. And we're here to make sure we understand all that nuance because that doesn't happen too much in this modern world. I'm pretty sure you're well aware of that too. Not a lot of people give you this quality of time that you're giving me right now today.
We don't listen. How did you learn to listen?
Listening comes in layers. Listening comes to paying very close attention. Listening comes from being in that basement at my grandparents' house with the aunts and uncles with the guitars out. And here's the funny thing. Listening is as much about what's coming into your ears and seeing and hearing what's going on as it is your eyes and sensing what's going on, as it is, your skin and picking up on like what the feelings are in the room and everything else. And I think from a very young age, I was very hyper aware of scanning that room for everything that's going on, for making sure, everything's okay, everything's the right way it should be and the right way it should feel. And if it's not, trying to figure out what do I need to do to help like nudge that forward. Teetering on the edge of something that like years of therapy have helped me unpack. But also at the same time, it's that you learn to listen by learning to listen with your whole body and learning to do that in some type of a social atmosphere.
I think it's a wonderful skill. And what I find in my work advising families is that a lot of people come to the table thinking that they have to impress with the skills and the experience and how competent I am. And this is a given. We assume that we're in the room because you believe that I'm competent. But the difference is that I'm actually here to listen because the quality of my work will improve dramatically if I know the context of what we're actually working with here. And it's the stories. And I want to talk about stories because you and I share this fascination. And I wrote down the transfer of stories, wealth, ideas. And I'll share it more after you tell me more about your perspective, but you have this fascination that I do too with this intergenerational bridge. And you started with the story of your compressed family, where you had this beautiful shorter bridge where you could actually go have a beer with your grandpa. Tell me, where did this fascination come from? Is this something you grew up with, something you grew to appreciate, that the stories are alive, the connection between the generations, and the work that you do is exactly that? Where did it come from?
The stories are kind of all there is. And I think I've known this intuitively maybe not the entire time. I learned it at some point. But at some point you realize it's the core stories below things that are really driving everything. It's the way people explain stuff to you. It's the way things make you feel. It's the way you make sense of a song in one way, at one point in life, and then in a different way at a later point in life. And you start to understand that that's the thing that's beneath everything. It's how us with our identities and egos and whatever else react to these stories, and then how those stories interact in the rest of the world. Accepted by others, rejected by others, brushed off by others, all the variations. What's really cool and really powerful about those is I think I learned from a young age, and then I definitely learned this in high school Matt punk rock days, the idea of how those stories again can be accepted or brushed off. So accepted in the sense of where you would look at something and say, like, I think we're as good, or we're better than, or we're more interesting than, or whatever, qualify it however you want. It's like, oh, I think I'm equivalent in my mind in some way to something else that I see happening, to some other band or something, or another guitar player, whatever it is. But like, why do people like that more than what they like what I'm doing? And these little puzzles that stories then turn around and open up become really, really insightful. Because what these puzzles do is it's this Rubik's Cube of starting to figure out, I thought these two things were equal, or I see why this thing's worth more than that, or whatever this discrepancy is between the value of two stories in the open marketplace. Borrowing some finance terms for a second. But when you start to see that, my brain kicks into overdrive on, you see the other metrics. It's different types of, whether it's chord progressions or what key it's in or what tempo or what genre of music, or all that stuff starts to fade into the back, and it starts to just become, why is this story perceived differently from that story? And is there something this story could do to all of a sudden be up here? Is there something this story could do to all of a sudden fall down to here? Is there something that would bring them to parity? What are all the ways these stories can be played with? What are all those variables? And always with them, it's about the audience. You figure out what's driving the story, and then you figure out who's hearing the story, what the audience is, and what that perception is. Whether it's advising families, a husband and a wife on a decision they have to make about the timing of a retirement, or, the husband and wife post-sale of a business with 3 separate homes and trying to figure out how do you gift what to which kid in which fair way, or the grandkids or whatever. Those are all stories with a bunch of variables, usually with one or multiple adults of some type of knowledge, ego, and whatever else, who needs help being heard, being listened to unpack the variables of their own story, so that we can figure out what's the transcendent principles behind this thing and what they're trying to do. They're not always perfect or virtuous or whatever else. We're messy people. That's part of the human experience. But unless you can see past the variables, unless you can see those underlying threads and understand that at the end of the day, no matter the fanciest mathematical model or explanation can be there and describe what's happening, but the actual poetry of the story itself, of what the people are going to tell themselves after it, that's kind of all that matters.
You're touching on so many things. What came to mind is, finance can be very scientific, mathematical, and I like to think that there's a portfolio that works on paper, and then there's a portfolio that works in real life. And I think any advice in the investment world works that way, that yes, on paper it makes sense, but you actually have to sit down with real people And you talked about feelings and an impact, and money is such an emotional experience. I was telling somebody a story how, if you go out this afternoon and you find a penny, just a penny, that penny has an impact on you. You're going to smile. You're going to think, look how lucky I am, right? Even the smallest penny has an impact on us. So think of a family fortune, a life-changing fortune that can set you for life and maybe 2-3 generations. It has a huge impact, and it takes a lot of understanding, empathy to see what's the meaning of that amount. What can it do? How can it change lives? And it goes way beyond picking a stock that will go up and realizing that it's a much more nuanced story. You mentioned in your writing and in conversations that we had about the importance of passing old stories to the new generation. And I'm a bit obsessed about that. I'm very, very curious. And whenever the family shares with me a story, I say, is this written down? Do your kids know? And it's that continuity. It's almost like a ribbon through time that connects families. And especially you mentioned something interesting, how, the original business might be gone and now it's a portfolio of holdings, but the legend of how the money came about, the grandpa, the grandma that made it across the ocean, whatever the tale is, there's always a tale. Let's tell those stories. Can you talk about the importance of those old stories within families and how they add value, importance, and maybe even some direction to what to expect next?
I think the hardest part about this is some stories just suck. Some stories aren't fun. Some stories are told poorly. But all stories are interesting. You just have to find the thing that makes them interesting and then extract them out. And frequently, it's not the same thing to everybody who hears the story. So not everybody who hears the story is going to be struck in the same way by the telling of the story itself. That complexity of character, that complexity of the fabric that a story occurs in is, I think, and I know this from client work and client experience, it's one of the parts that makes talking about passing personal values as well as financial values one of the hardest things we do when we do intergenerational wealth planning or multi-generational wealth planning. This idea that the thing that grandma and grandpa think is valuable about the boat ride over and not having any money and starting the business from scratch and all those things, the grandkids, the great-grandkids, G4, might not have any way to relate to that. They might not relate to the boat ride. They might not relate to starting the business from scratch. They might not relate to the hustling and the brutality of like what it meant to go through this thing. So then, if you really care about your story, and this is where people like you and I can come into play, we can start to recontextualize how does some other generation find the thing that matters to them. One of my favorite examples of this, Orson Scott Card. Were you a Ender's Game person? Did you ever read those books, or are you familiar? It's sci-fi stuff from forever ago.
More. Tell me about it.
So this was familiar with the first book. I think they make kids read it when they enter the Marines or the military or something even. And Ender's Game is fine. They made it a movie. The movie was kind of a dud. The book is fine. I don't want to say it's great. I don't want to say, it's better than mid, but it's not amazing, as the kids might say. But it's a cool story about basically a almost like savant level military genius kid in this program where they're looking for kids who can do this stuff, where he's elevated up to this level of the military and I'm spoiling something, but not too much, because if you've avoided it by this amount of time, like, okay, it's a book from the 80s, like whatever. The kid's basically fighting a real world war. It's just a virtual war in his interface, but it's actually with real stakes, real lives on the line. It's this huge thing. But it's all about the way this like savant kid experiences being put in this adult world and doing this thing. And it's an amazing story. It's a great story. It's a reason they've made movies about it. There's a reason it's still like a well-selling book. But you read it when you're a kid and you relate to Ender, or you kind of relate to Ender, or you kind of put yourself in those shoes and you think about those things. I went back to reread it as an adult, just as it was one of those like pandemic things. Like I always wanted to reread that. The movie sucked, but I always wanted to reread that. And it feels really one-dimensional on the reread. And I start going like, Bean, the friend, is not that, like, he's got this friend who's kind of a competitor, but is like pushing him to get to the next level and is one-dimensional. Mom and dad, it's like you have these kids who are basically involved in these giant, like, multi-level conspiracy theories, and mom and dad are just like oblivious. Like what political world are the parents living in? And you start to have all these questions. There's not one, but there's two series that flow out of this story that Orson Scott Card wrote. And that is the regular series, which follows Ender through basically the rest of his lifetime. Wonderful, wonderful layers of nuance. But then he also wrote this thing called the Shadow series. And the Shadow series is basically the retelling of all the books a second time, but from like every other character's perspective.
Oh.
Only in sci-fi, right? So the crazy part about this is all those questions that I started getting piqued in my mind as an adult, revisiting a story that I no longer completely related to, something in his development as a writer, as an author, and with the success of the books was to then turn around and reimagine all these stories from all these other perspectives. And you get stuff like, of course the parents know what the kids are up to. Of course they're aware of like defying the local politicians in this sense, but participating in the other sense. Of course they're aware of what opportunity to give their kids and avoid and all this crap in the middle. And that willingness to tear your story back down to the studs and think about how the next generation is going to decorate the friggin' house. That's really hard to do. And if you're not willing to go there, or you don't have the tools, or you're not equipped to go there, like as the advisor, like one of my favorite ugly stats in our industry is in the traditional wealth management industry, how many people basically fire the advisor on the death of, like, the first spouse dies, the surviving spouse fires the advisor, goes to somebody new. Kids inherit the money from mom and dad. They go to a new advisor. Happens all of the time. And it happens all the time because people don't understand how to tear those stories down to their studs, put up new walls, have new decorations for Christmas, keep enough of the old story and the old values intact, but new stories have to emerge, and we have to be comfortable with that evolution.
Yeah, I love that. And it made me think of Rockefeller's letters to his son. I'm sure you're familiar. And there are a couple of those. So he wrote letters to his son to give him a lot of guidance. But there was one letter that really stood out to me when I was thinking about what you were just saying, how he describes how he was so poor that for a photo, I think it was a photo in his high school or school, they asked him not to be in the photo because it was embarrassing for the teacher of the school that he looked so poorly dressed. And he's telling the story to his son, who grew up with this unimaginable wealth. And his son has no chance to ever relating to that story. Most of us don't have a chance, right? And he still feels like it's such a big part of who he is. And in his mind, if nobody's watching, they still see him in those poor clothes. And he can't escape that image. But that transition, he's trying to tell the story to just the next generation over. But it's such a huge distance. That's why I brought up the word bridge, because the distance is so big that there's no way that his son can relate to that story.
So this tape has on it, first song is Higher Ground, which is a Stevie Wonder song. And this is a quasi hit for the Chili Peppers in the era. This has Fire, which is a Jimi Hendrix song on here. Now this is mostly like mid to late 80s Red Hot Chili Peppers, a little bit into the early 90s. But so we have a Stevie Wonder song that's 15 years before. We have a Jimi Hendrix song that's basically 20 plus years before they wrote this. They have If You Want Me to Stay, a 70s Sly and the Family Stone song that are all before this. And this is on top of other influences that are layered onto this. These are late 80s, early reimaginations of songs from 10, 20, and 30 years prior to the existence of this band that I'm getting served to me in my headphones doing dishes to green palm olive dish soap and going like, I love this song. Now I was already into Jimi Hendrix. So that was like a cool, like, oh, well, this is there. But then, my parents have the Stevie Wonder albums. My parents have the Sly Stone albums. And all of a sudden it's like, I'm playing this tape, I'm playing these tapes, I'm playing these things. I'm starting to get curious and read the liner notes and all that stuff. And it's like, oh, I need this gateway to open those other doors. We don't spend enough time figuring out the right gateway to open the doors to set the table for that next conversation. I think that is massively missing in the wealth management industry. And I think that's why you and I have careers, because we came in as outsiders to something and are obsessed with how do we translate this for some people that we know are interested, but punk rock economics again, we have to make them interested in being part of this scene. Otherwise, they're never going to show up.
Love that. I'm going to write that down. Make them interested. Well, we've been talking a lot about the past, and you and I had a conversation about nostalgia, a certain kind of nostalgia. Do you pronounce it anemoia? Anemoia? Am I pronouncing it right?
I don't know. I'm saying anemoia, and I have no clue how to properly pronounce this. But that's great that you're attempting it as poorly as I am, apparently.
I want to bring it up because you called it the nostalgia for a time or a place no one has ever known. And I find it fascinating because I think it's a human condition that we kind of rewrite the past, and somehow the past is always more glorious, at least some parts of it, than it was really the case. And I'll briefly just mention that Poland, where I grew up, is experiencing this nostalgia for 1920s, 1930s, which to some people is a memory of the golden age between World War I and World War II. When Poland had independence, there was some growth. There was obviously hyperinflation and some impact of the Great Depression as well. But somehow there's this memory of expansion, growth, promise. There was a big port built at the time. There were even first flights. And I don't know if you know, but a lot of air traffic was regulated by an act that's called a Warsaw Document or something like that.
Yeah, the Warsaw Document, I think. That sounds right.
But anyways, when you land in Warsaw, you go to the airport hotel. It's all themed in the 1920s, 1930s, early aircraft travel, nostalgia, and the names and the bar and the names of the drinks are references to 1920s, 1930s. I'll add one more thing. If you get a new passport from Poland, which I did not long ago, they put all kinds of characters from 1920s, 1930s, different politicians and famous people from that period. And we're 100 years later, so it's kind of cool to open the passport. It looks like a little history book. So the word nostalgia is massive, and I can see how it's popping up in my life in so many ways, and this is just one of them. But I feel like we all have those ideas of what life was all about in the 1950s, 1960s. Everybody had a house in the suburbs and a car, and where is this world now? Can you talk about that nostalgia, the anemoia? What is it? Why are we experiencing it?
So I'm really hoping, I'm not going to say it on here because I need to know this is going to happen before I say this is going to happen. I can tell you what did happen. What did happen is I had a phenomenal conversation at a conference a couple of weeks ago in Nashville, Tennessee. And I got to interview Kyla Scanlon, who I'm sure you know, and I'm sure most of your listeners know. Kyla's got a new book out. It's phenomenal, called In This Economy. And she talks a lot about these ideas. And she talks a lot about this thing, another word I don't know how to say, anomie, anomie, which is basically like a lack of like standards or other things with things. And I was in the moment temporarily blown away. This is as we kind of like with this conversation right before we got on stage because something got rescheduled. And I was like, I want to get Kyla Scanlon because I know she writes a lot about nostalgia and these things. And I don't know if you know Scott Bradley or not. Scott Bradley is the creator of a YouTube channel and band called Postmodern Jukebox. And their whole thing is they take modern era songs and they will do them in like an old style. So they'll do a like Billie Eilish song as like a ragtime piano thing or whatever. And so it's a really interesting multi-generational study on how to basically take a new song, tell it in an old way, or take an old thing and tell it in a newer way, and mix and mash these up. You and I need to go see them live at some point so you can see the multi-generations in this room and unpack what's going on. There's complete side fascination. So I've really wanted to get Scott's take, because he's made a whole business out of the post-modernization of nostalgia, effectively, with music. And you see it in the audiences that show up to see him play with the band. And then Kyla also writes about this a lot too, and this idea of anomie, which is this, again, like a lack of standard. So here's what Scott's doing, which is a complete fulfillment of standard, of bowing to the constructs of like, okay, I'm going to make a song and I'm going to do a spaghetti Western, Sergio Leone quality, like Western arrangement, or the quality of the way these songs are put together is so profoundly good and so profoundly smart that it's like no detail is uncared for in those arrangements. And what Kyla's been pointing out is this nostalgia for like a complete lack of standard in online social behavior and all these places where you're just like, what is even going on? Does no one even care? Like, we don't even bother to set the table. We just come in and we roll through and we make a mess and we roll out. Talking to them about nostalgia and what it means to both of them, I brought up this concept of anemoia, or however you say it. And this idea about, if you don't have any standard, is part of the next thing. And Freya India, which I highly, highly endorse, go look her up, subscribe to her writing. She's the one who put anemoia in my brain. She's the one who's writing about all this. She's a brilliant thinker. And Freya India, as she explained it, is just kind of this generation who's never held a cassette in their hands. They've never read the liner notes. They've never experienced this stuff. They're yearning and they're nostalgic for something they never owned. I don't know if that's part of why vinyl sales are up, or that's part of why people want to be offline and use a rotary phone or whatever. I can't explain it like that exactly, but there is a yearning to have physical connection in physical space and other things in a world that's increasingly online. Now, here's the meta step back thing from this that I have to do now, is nostalgia, even as a story that we tell ourselves about what it is. Because there's nostalgia for conservatism reasons in politics. There's nostalgia for conservative reasons in social structures and whatever else. I don't want my kid to marry a person from the other faith or the other town or the other whatever. Like, they have all these reasons we don't want things to change, because we as humans fear change because the tiger's going to jump out and it's going to eat us. Well, what's that mean when, you can't have a notification on your phone or something that you can't leave unmarked or unresponded to? What's that mean if you grew up as part of this generation? What's that mean in all these ways? Even the story about nostalgia is changing in real time around us. And we're seeing that in the ways that it shows up when anomie, with this idea of not having those standards. And then when you don't have those standards, it shows up in anemoia, and we feel the ways that all of a sudden now we're yearning for things that we haven't even known in our lifetimes. We have stuff like, because that's what you're describing in Poland, where it's like people are yearning for something that's 100 years ago. Like, there's not even living people who can remember that and tell those stories. Likewise, financial markets. How many people do we work with that were around when and actively allocating, trading, or planning when inflation last reared its head for an extended period of time?
True.
The stories and the experiences change in real time. Tracking, as my dear friend Ben Hunt always talks about, the common knowledge of the stories that people tell becomes one of the most useful and interesting things we can do. Because outside of spotting a change in a market or something like that, it also helps us tell the stories when the family member selling their business is trying to figure out how to pass those values on to their kids. And we have to go, oh, your kid's never been on vacation except for on a private jet. They can't comprehend you having no money and starting something from zero. They can't definitionally know that. I don't care how many times you tell them that story. It doesn't actually mean anything to them. It doesn't mean they have to understand your story in your way, but they have to understand their story in their way. And those are two very different problems to solve.
the stories I've heard time and time again from younger members of families, and it came usually later. They would tell me something that happened 10 or 20 years ago, would be the period when they left the family and they went somewhere. They volunteered somewhere. One of the people I'm thinking of, I think he had some military army experience that was completely different than the comfortable life that he lived with. Or went to a country that's so different than the country they know, where people live with a lot less than you can imagine. And I think just seeing the wider range of arrangements of life out there, I think it's eye-opening. And the second thing that they shared with me, which I find very valuable, is to make a name for yourself in a field that's different than the one that the family dominated. And I thought it was very powerful because it's following somebody's footsteps. It's tricky. But historically, it's not that uncommon, because if you were a shoemaker, then your son was a shoemaker. And in Europe, I mean, around the world, there has been a tradition of passing things on, right? So it's you would follow the footsteps. But I think the scale and the proportion that we talk about, growing up with substantial life-changing wealth, it's good and it's helpful from what I've learned to step away and see the bigger world outside, to be able to come back and look inside at what is it that you actually grew up with.
So a thing that I'm fascinated by that I haven't been able to corral this thought yet, which is a terrible excuse to bring it up in a podcast that I'm unprepared for.
Do it.
But I have to share this with you because this is the thought that I keep having, because it's related to exactly that point. There's the anemoia for the things that I'm aware of, but I have no firsthand experience of. There's the anomy, which is I no longer understand I'm disconnected from the standard of the thing. So I have firsthand experience, but not with the same standard or some detachment in that say. And then there's the in the Jungian sense, the anima and the animus, which is like the most traditional sense of the interpretation of it, like moving from the divine feminine to the divine masculine and vice versa. The connection that I think is there is what you just said in the exit or in the change. When you leave the social group, when you leave the town, when you leave the country, when you leave the unit, it could be later. It could be the death of a spouse. It could be a divorce. It could be the sale of a business. Usually what that happens, and I want to soften like the gender terminology on like the masculine and feminine here. Like that's not the point that matters. It's the metaphorical construct that we're talking about. It's the idea of you don't really have a story until you've come full circle on those things. And this is part of, I think, opening up a new, I don't want to call it a nostalgia loop, but I can't think of how else to put it. Like it's opening up a new story is when you've actually completed the loop of your understanding of what that move that encapsulates both proverbial like genders in this thing. And it's this idea of the symbology, the metaphor, the variables, all the stuff we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, where I realize where the poles are, where the extremes are. I understand where the night and the day is, where the male and the female is. I understand where the poles of this story are, and not just the way it moves from A to B, but the way that circle turns over from yin to yang, etc. That piece of like an exit into the unknown, birthing a new outcome, a new future, a new path, is part of like the requirement of the story within the story that helps us understand this stuff. And there's no change, there's no evolution without having something that like broke away and went back into the unknown. Because in the truest like Jungian sense, when we're talking about this stuff, we're talking about that break into the unknown, that break into the void, that break into the darkness, and the like that's the womb in storytelling terms. That's the ocean. That's the deep unseated unknown that the other thing lies on the other side of. That's winter becoming spring. That's night becoming day. You need that break into that chasm to come up out into a new place.
You know, it makes me think of The Alchemist and Paulo Coelho. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because recently we were in Richmond, Virginia, and Megan went to a bookstore and she remembered me talking about this book years ago. So she found an old copy of that book.
Of The Alchemist?
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome.
And she read it, and I read it again, and now one of the friends is reading it. But it's that story of leaving the place that you're very familiar with. There's so many layers to the story, but one layer for me is you leave the place that you're very familiar with. You go see the world. You get to know yourself through this journey. You come back a full circle, and you realize that what you were looking for, if you were looking for anything, it's right where you started. But you couldn't find it without leaving. Pico Iyer, who writes about travel, he has this saying that rhymes with it, that you have to leave to get to know yourself. Like, you can't fully get to know yourself without ever leaving. And I find it fascinating because it's that moment of realization. How do I get to know myself better? And how do I see more of the world? And you're laughing. You have some fun about it.
I'm laughing because, and this is a Justin Castelli, our mutual friend, and Justin loves this book, as he should. And part of Justin's love for this book, and this is one of those books that I'm aware of. I'm actually pretty sure, you know, those books you read or you kind of read, but they don't really leave an impression on you.
Uh-huh.
This is me and The Alchemist. So I was aware of, definitely read most of, if not all of, because it's hazy memories. But not until a year ago have I really read The Alchemist in full that I can say I remember this and whatever. So probably in high school or something, I was forced to read it and read half of it, and that's probably what this boils down to. On the reread, and Justin had brought something up somewhere, either to me or in a podcast or something that I heard about. So did you reread it, or did Megan just reread it?
No, I read it again, and I have to tell you that I would highly recommend reading it again, because sometimes
you need to reread it. Yeah, this is going to be a regular reread for me going forward. I already know.
I don't think I was ready for that book when I was reading it, and I don't remember how long ago that was, but it was a long time ago. And sometimes we're not ready for certain books, and it's okay. And it's okay to go back and read it, because I think the life experience and everything else gives us more lenses and tools to interpret. And you know, two people read the same book, and you realize we really read two different books, because it's a very personal experience, and it's a very personal book. It's written in a very accessible way, and it takes you on a journey, and it's a beautiful journey, and it leaves a lot to imagination, but it brings you back to where you started.
So I gotta ask this, because this was my ready to throw the book moment in the good way.
Okay.
Do you remember the parable or the story that starts the book from this reread? And I'm going on memory here, so forgive me if I butcher this, but I'm confident enough to at least throw this out there. Do you remember what the book starts with? What mythological tale is in the intro?
Yes. Is it the reflection in the lake, the narcissist?
It's the story of Narcissist.
Yes. Wow, you remember very well.
Because this was like my wife can probably remember me screaming from the kitchen and being like, "Are you okay?" And I'm just like, "No, The Alchemist." It's got me. So the Narcissist story. So Narcissist looks into the body of water, and Narcissist looks into the body of water, falls in love with his own reflection. There's a couple of different mythological interpretations of the story, but for sake of this and not spoiling too much of people's enjoyment, that's the basic idea. Narcissist looks at his own reflection, falls in love with his own reflection, eventually dies in love with himself. The story of The Alchemist. We're spoiling The Alchemist. If you haven't read the book, this and Ender's Game are now ruined for you forever. What?
Okay, let's do it.
Did you relate Alchemist to the ending? Did you relate the story of Narcissist into the end of that book? I feel like I can't remember if I already told this to Justin or I just said next time you reread it we have to have this conversation. Did you tie those things together in your mind?
I didn't. But how did you?
The main character, the alchemist, or now as we find out, he's not the alchemist in the story, but that's a whole other thing. But anyway, he finds himself by looking into the sky. He tries to find himself by looking into the desert, by finding the oasis. Basically, the opposite of the lake. There's no body of water that he can cast his eye into. His great unknown that he finds himself in is not looking down into the body of water of the lake. In fact, when he looks down, the body that's there is the sand, is the nothing. He finds himself and connects to the others when he looks up into the sky. And when he finds himself, he finds his community, he finds his wife, he finds all the gifts of the universe filling him back up, not depending on that to take his ego out. There's a lesson in ego dissolution. There's a lesson in magic. There's a lesson in what you can and can't turn into treasure and what actually treasure is, in that metaphor of just the direction of the gaze and narcissist falling in love with himself, and Paulo Coelho's character just falling in love with the beauty of the world. And I was just so moved by that last time I read it.
You can live your life as if nothing is a miracle, or you can live your life as if everything is a miracle. William Green reminded me of that, and I think it's a beautiful way of looking at the world, in awe of everything around us. That it's pretty cool stuff. It's magical.
I like to say that I spent most of my life in the nothing happens for a reason, you just make it up camp. And I'm still in that camp. But what I've accepted is, I used to get mad at the everything happens for a reason people, because I'd be like, that's naive. Like, you stubbed your toe? Oh, oh, I'm sure, the divine watchmaker had said, you need to stub your toe and have a crappy Tuesday. That was the thing that used to drive me crazy. But now what I've accepted is everything happens for a reason and nothing happens for a reason are two sides of the same coin. And the connective thread is, if I say nothing happens for a reason, that means all the reason is inside of my head or our heads or whatever else. And if I go around assigning a reason to everything, that's no different than everything already happening for a reason, because I just changed the causal order of that thing, but I still have the same takeaway effect. And so I look at these things of like, yeah, everything's a miracle or everything's meaningless. It's like, well, put some meaning behind it. Because if it's meaningless, then it's myth of Sisyphus all the way down. Like if this is the point of Camus' thing, not to get all dark, but it's, if life is meaningless, then like you just end it all. Then that's what suicide's for. But Camus asked the question with Sisyphus. He said, don't worry about Sisyphus pulling the rock up the mountain and why he wants to escape Hades and his eternal damnation. What you really need to focus on is Sisyphus walking back down the mountain to get the rock and do it again. One must imagine Sisyphus happy is Camus' big revelation. The existential, the absurdist way of just basically going, yeah, I'm going to do this task again, but it's better to be alive. It's better to be smiling on the way back down the mountain to accept that challenge against the gods again than anything else, because that's the meaning we have to make it worth it. And by God, if you don't think it's worth it, like, you're missing out on a lot of fun.
Would you call it independently happy?
I want to be careful about the word, because I don't think you can separate it. So you have to be independently happy within yourself, and in a way that your core beliefs about yourself, about others, about your future or the future have to be positive and optimistically slanted in a way that you can have a bias in yourself that you are independently happy, and that's that way. However, I can't put you in a like blackout silent room with no awareness of anybody else or whatever and just put you on a feeding tube and assume that you'll be able to achieve that state. It's not saying we have to go be social creatures in the most egregious sense of like going to parties all the time and having 1,000 friends, but it is to say you need that inherent happy bias inside of yourself, that optimistic bias inside of yourself. And then you have to be able to step into a world that sometimes is going to stub your toe. Sometimes the world's going to stomp on your toe. Sometimes the world is going to drop a piano on your toe. And you have to figure out how you can independently be biased against those actions that make no sense. And just go, I'm going to roll the rock again the next day. And find other people who are on that same trajectory. And maybe keep your distance from the people who want to drop pianos on your toes or aren't paying attention to what they're doing. Because that's a lot of humanity too.
Thinking of the interpretation We talked about stories, and I'm reading a history book. I think the author is Philip Parker, and the beginning of the book, the history, is the character. Like he tells the story in a different way than I've ever seen before. Because usually when you open a history book, it starts with, this is the first thing we know. Well, I'm joking here, Adam and Eve, whatever the beginning you choose. Yeah. But he says, how do we know? And I love that question because most of my life is about, how do I know? And I want to go back to the source. Like, if this is a good company, but how do I know? Somebody told me about it. Can I see the original filings? Can I talk to the management? Or can I talk to the family? Somebody tells me, well, they wouldn't want to do this, or they want to do this. Can I talk to them? Can I hear it from them? I want to always go to the source. How do they even say it? And it's fascinating because our interpretation is the key here, right? We tell a story, and you talked about restructuring the stories and so on. But our own story, and I know you have some thoughts about it. I hope we have a few minutes to talk about it, but I want to bring up a topic that you brought up with me briefly, and I hope you're open. The cognitive behavioral therapy that I'm just reading more about, and I'm very curious about it, and maybe you can introduce the audience to the concept. But to me, it's the rewriting, the interpretation of what's happening to us. We might not have control over stubbing our foot into the wall or the bed, but we do have a choice of how we react to it, and even for how long. Like, it's okay to be upset about it, but if you're upset about it 3 days later, it becomes a choice.
So I have to say, this is a soapbox I'm prepared to start climbing on. And I need to do some more work on this still to fully. I got to bug some more of our clinical psychology related friends for make sure my history is all straight on this, because I didn't go to college for this. I didn't study any of this stuff at all. This is just a side interest for decades now and personal interest from my own experience. But I firmly believe Dr. Aaron T. Beck, basically the creator of cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of cognitive psychology for that point. He's a contemporary, effectively, to Kahneman and Tversky. And we know them in our business, and we know them because Michael Lewis wrote his book, about them. We know them from all the behavioral finance stuff. I've got a business partner, my partner, Michael Pompian. He's written books and books on behavioral finance and that side of behavioral psychology. We don't talk about Aaron Beck. I don't know why we don't talk about Aaron Beck more. Some people do. The clinical psychologists, like the Daniel Crosbys and the Brian Portnoys, prior guests you've had, they talk about Beck, but the other people leave it off. And when you're talking about biases and heuristics and all that stuff, it's not that Kahneman and Tversky were unaware of the work of Beck and of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's just that, they're academics, they're writing in their lanes and in their silos to explain these little pieces. But I feel like lately, certainly in the last 10 years post-financial crisis, our industry's become obsessed with a third, maybe 2/3, but maybe even less, maybe 1/5 of the elephant we're describing. Cognitive behavioral therapy kind of helps fill in the gap. Beck's name should be up there with Kahneman and Tversky when we talk about applied behavioral finance, human-centric advice, all these things in the businesses that we're running when we take care of people. So it's right in the name, first and foremost, cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive, thinking and feeling. Behavioral, things we do, actions we take, choices we make or don't make, choose not to is as important as choose to. And then therapy, we can do something about it. So when I'm thinking, so a thing happens in my life, I stub my toe, I have the feeling of the toe being stubbed, I have the emotion that arises that, oh no, I'm angry. I have these things, these automatic reactions, and those are behaviors. And that's what Beck would say is, so we have these core beliefs. I mentioned this earlier, not knowing we were going to land here, but these the core beliefs of how you think about yourself, how you think about others, and basically how you think about the future. Those make up your core beliefs. We can take those core beliefs and now we can go, okay, what are my, again, cognitive, thinking and feeling? What are my behaviors? What I'm going to choose to do or choose not to do about it? And then the therapy of how can I amend? How can I think through? How can I process this stuff as I experienced it. I stubbed my toe. It was the middle of the night. It was dark. Oh no. It's going to be sore for a couple of days. Big deal. I have a cut on my finger that is slowly healing because I got this. My wife and I got a wonderful gift of knives 6 months ago, and they're great. I've never had a really nice knife set like this, let alone one that in the block has a sharpener. And I no longer have to get out the separate sharpening tool and do the thing. And I only do it if I'm making like a steak or something that I really need a sharp knife for. But now it's like, oh, taking the knife out because I'm going to chop a friggin' onion because I've got the whole family coming over for Father's Day or whatever the thing was where multiple generations of family members came over for Father's Day. So I take the knife. I take the vegetable knife, which normally I would never even sharpen anyway. And now I'm sharpening it up. I got this edge. I go to cut my red onion, and because I'm not a chef, I have terrible technique. My mise en place is all off, and just like, boom, it goes like hot knife through butter right into my friggin' tip of my finger.
Goodness.
My wife's like, every time you're making steaks or like a big fancy dinner for other people and you're chopping stuff, you always cut yourself. I'm like, I never cut myself with the vegetables, though. This is a new experience. But the point is, like, can you get mad at that? Yeah, of course you can get mad at it. I could have been mad at that for days. I could have said I just screwed up the whole meal because the first cut of the onion, I accidentally wasn't paying attention to a cross cut and went into my finger because I have poor technique. But instead, you wrap a paper towel around it. You go, I'll change this out a couple of times, whatever. And the real reason I'm here is because I've got 3 generations of Zeiglers in this room. Well, a DeBellis and 2 Zeiglers. But I've got 3 generations of men in this room right now. I've got another generation. They couldn't make it, but almost came. My brother and his kids, they had work. He had work. But it's like, what actually matters here? Cognitive behavioral therapy is this idea that I can step back, I can think about how I'm thinking, how I'm feeling, how I'm behaving, how I'm processing that triangle around those core beliefs and say what actually matters here. What happens to me? What happens to the people I'm taking care of? What happens in the future that I want to create? And how am I choosing to have that optimistic future on the situation that I create? That includes occasionally realizing you're on the wrong track, you're doing something stupid, you need to stop. I know a lot about doing stupid things that you should stop, that you don't stop. Very, very, very well versed in that side of the house. But I also know is a little thing like cutting my finger when I'm getting the red onion ready for the, Gorgonzola steak salad. It's a finger, Neosporin. We're a week and change on. It's pretty much healed. I haven't been able to play guitar in a week, but I'm not bleeding on things anymore. And that's good enough for me. Did I answer the question on CBT? Did I give enough of it?
You did. You gave us a flavor. I feel like, in a nutshell, things happen to us and we choose how to react to them. As easy, as simple as it sounds, but very hard to execute. And I love the story because you just cut your finger, but you introduced us to this whole story of multiple generations coming together and on and on and on.
To eat a meal on a Sunday afternoon because is it a pain in the ass to get all that stuff together? Yes. Did I cut myself getting this stuff together? Yes. All that stuff is a horrible bother. But I knew I would be happy that I did it. I knew the others would be happy that my wife and I gathered everyone in our home to do this special event. And I know that this is the investment in the future, is the act of like making these commitments to blow out a Sunday to do this type of deal. It's the most important thing to get those communities of people together and just have a good time, make everybody smile. Life's too short. Even if you're walking down the mountain, you got to do it smiling. Extra camo.
I love it. Well, let me wrap it up and try to mention a few things we talked about. You told us about your compressed family with grandparents and parents being very close in age and having that experience with your grandpa, which I really loved, a connection, a bridge that I think inspired a lot of what you do these days, connecting generations, listening to people. We talked about money and music, and I love the story about the music experience and the punk rock experience that you had. You also talk about not knowing what a stock and bond is. I think you mentioned it 3 times. And I loved it because I think it gave you the permission to introduce other people to concepts they're not familiar with. You were on the other side. You were the outsider. And I hugely value that, being an outsider, because I think it allows us to introduce more people. And I think money, investing, wealth, broadly defined, there's a better way to talk about it. And we spend a lot of time talking about stories and how we structure them, how we retell them. And we talked about opening the gateways. I really like the part when you mentioned that with a client, and I think in life in general, you want to be seen, heard, and valued. And I highlighted that. I really like that. I think we all appreciate that. And maybe the part about podcasting that I like is that I have my guest's attention and my guest has my attention. And there are not too many moments in life where we can have that for an hour, that you have somebody like that at a conference event, family event, anything, to have somebody for an hour and they're just with you and you're just with them. It's very hard to replicate.
With clients, I think, and I say this to my team, this is a part inside of our company we talk about, like that's the least quantifiable thing we can do outside of the constraint of time. But it's also, in many cases, the most valuable thing we could do of just saying, like, I'm giving my time and my attention to this person that I could give to a million other things. But I'm going to sit here and listen to them and try to get to the core of what's, not even what's bothering them, just what's on their mind and paying attention. It's not all of what we do by miles, but is it a huge bulk of our actual value? Because if you don't do that, can you do anything else? I don't actually think you can, not in a genuine and earnest way. Coca-Cola can sell me a Coke just fine. It can be a perfectly good Coke, perfectly delicious, cold, crisp, well caffeinated Coca-Cola. I'm talking myself into wanting a Coke right now. But they don't have the relation with me that transcends that Coke the way that, and this is why, I'd like to buy a world of Coke. This is why buy the world of Coke. This is why those campaigns, that marketing matters so much. Sharing the Coke is where all the value is. The experience of who you have it with. Wonderful, wonderful branding, wonderful marketing, not a stock pitch by a million years, but it is a way to say, like, even those things, like if I'm in a transactional business of just even selling somebody something, take the focus as fast as you can away from selling it to them, put all the focus on the social experience that comes on the side of how you enjoy that thing. With us in our business, it's our time. That's what people really want. They want our expertise, but it only comes through setting the table with that time and attention.
Time and attention. Wow. In all of this, we also talked a lot about nostalgia, a certain kind of nostalgia. And I wrote down at the end, stubbing your toe and cutting your finger. I don't know why we ended up with, I hope you still have both your toes and your finger and everything in place as
both toes.
As you should.
As you should. Yeah.
But all I want to say, and I wrote it down for myself, even if you stub your toe and cut your finger, you can still be independently happy. And I think that's, it's up to you to interpret whatever is happening. I loved it. Matt, this was great. I had so much fun. I think I got through about half of what I had in mind, but I think we covered the big themes that I think represent what you're about, what kind of work you do, and who you are to your family, to your friends, to your clients. I think that beams through this conversation, and I think everybody gets a flavor of the Matt that I'm getting to know.
This behind me too, this Banksy. I can't remember. Did we talk about this before? Do you know what's on the other side of this, just out of frame?
No, I see it.
The reason this is on the wall is because this is a little girl basically smiling in the rain, and the rain being all the colors, and she's all the colors. The other side of this is a very angry-looking businessman, only in black and white. So you can see her colors of black and white underneath here. The businessman is only in black and white, and he's holding an umbrella, and the umbrella is blocking all the color from hitting him. He's very angry, and he's holding a suitcase. That's why that girl's there.
Was it a gift? Was this painting a gift?
A few years ago, after some hard life stuff, I was moving into an apartment, and it was a real start over type moment in life where I knew I was on the precipice of making a bunch of serious changes, including changing jobs and whatever else. This is what happens at the end of these podcasts. These things come out, right?
Yeah, good stuff. Yeah.
And one of the first things I bought for this apartment, because I realized I was going to walk out of this bedroom into this kitchen living room area every single day. And it was fantastic too. I actually watched the sunrise every single morning. That was very important in all sorts of physical and metaphysical reasons. but I bought this picture to basically go. So as soon as I would walk out of the bedroom, it was the first thing I would see every day. It was that reminder of like, don't be the miserable corporate guy with the umbrella blocking out all the fun. Be the little girl smiling in the rain.
I love it. Have some color in your life.
Have some color in your life.
Matt, this was incredible. Let's save everything else for the next one, but this was so much fun.
I'll be back. I want to be the Talking Billions like all-timer recurring
yeah.
guest. That's my goal.
We'll definitely make it happen again.
I need a jacket like they give the Saturday Night Live guys. Although when it's not hot, save it for winter. Yeah, send me a sticker.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you, Bogomil.